Good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending the seminar. My name is Richard Olson, and together with Kate Goodman, we'll be giving the presentation. Well, actually, Kate will be doing most of the presentation on layoff versus furlough from an HR perspective. So, if we talk through just very quickly who we are. So, we're an advisory service that's been fully funded by the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority, and we cover the following areas, which are, in essence, the old Cambridgeshire and Peterborough LEP area, which is Cambridgeshire plus the surrounding counties attached to them. This is a completely free service. We have local partnerships with the likes of Cambridgeshire Chambers of Commerce, the Federation of Small Businesses, the IOD, Make UK, plus all the other council areas as well. We have a team of business advisors who have a vast range of knowledge covering a variety of skills such as HR, finance, marketing, import, export, IP, business cost reduction. And we're running a series of dedicated webinars over the next few weeks, including today's one, covering accessing finance, marketing from crisis communication standpoint, importing, exporting, working from home, employee wellbeing and mental wealth. And today we're talking about HR layoff versus furlough, and can it be backdated, how does it work, etc. At which point I'm now going to pass over to my colleague Kate.
Lovely, thank you, Reg. So today some of the things I really wanted to focus on were some of the options that are available to employers, and some of the things that you might want to explore when you think about managing your people through the current crisis. And certainly to think about whether or not it's too late to make any changes to some of the decisions that you might have already made. So looking at the right hand side of the screen, this is some of the areas that I want to cover off today. So I think, looking at that first subject of options, it's very difficult to predict the future, and there's been a huge amount of information that you as an employer are going to absorbed over the last few weeks and will continue to have to absorb. And I think in doing that, it can be very easy to miss things and make mistakes in your decision making. So I just want to run through today some of the options available to you that you can be considering. Now, whilst everything feels very different right now, a few things do remain constant, and one of those things are our legislative requirements and ensuring that you maintain compliance as an employer in terms of employment law. So we do have some new incoming laws and directives that are certainly worth looking at today to ensure that not only are you doing the right thing, but you're doing it in the right way. And then specifically, I'm just going to dip into three key areas. So the first is the job retention scheme, and let's have a look at some of the details of that. Then want to have a look at layoff and short-time working. And then finally, we'll have a quick look at redundancy, just to really bring you up to speed with those three things. I'm going to touch just very briefly on sickness and how to manage sickness in the workplace, and look at the support available to employers should they have employees that contract coronavirus. And then finally, we will summarise and just some thoughts for you to take away. So it'd be great if you could ask questions as we go, maybe type those into the questions or the chat box, and we'll pick those up at the end. But as Rich said, we are available for specific one-to-one sessions if you wanted to talk about something that's very specific to your business. So when we think about how we should approach some of the challenges we've got in terms of HR, I think the first thing to do that's very important is to assess where your business is and do that effectively. So there are a number of companies out there who will have reacted to the situation very quickly and then reviewed their position and looked at the government grants and schemes that were available to support them, and then have potentially thought that their initial decisions were maybe not quite the right decisions to have made. So I think critically important that you follow a proper process when you're starting to think about making decisions or reviewing the decisions that you've already made. So for some businesses, of course, there will be no impact to their business currently, or they may even be in business growth. And so it's really important to think about where you may well be. Now, we've got 75% of companies reporting that they intend to furlough a good percentage of their workforce. So I think those in growth are going to be in the minority, but nevertheless, you do want to consider that. So I think the first thing to do is to consider and review whether or not COVID-19 has already affected your business, or whether it has potential to negatively impact it moving forward, and whether that's going to affect both the services you offer and therefore have a knock-on effect to your employee base. So moving across the screen, if we think that's a no, then some of the things you need to be thinking about are supporting your business and people through what is now a very difficult time. So you may well have employees that are working in the workplace who are uncomfortable about coming to work. It might be because they see themselves in a vulnerable group and would like to be furloughed. It may well be that they simply feel guilty that they're coming into the workplace every day when all messages are telling us to stay at home where possible. So you really do need to think about engaging with your employees, making them aware of why you've chosen to keep the business open and what the likely future is going to be for them. Secondly, if you think you expect the impact to have a negative impact on your business, then you need to think about, is that going to be in the short term or in the longer term? So on the right hand side, if you think you are going to be impacted, but very much in the short term in the next 3 months, then I think there are a number of things that you could be doing. Firstly, you could be reviewing your financial commitments and your staff costs. And I would do that certainly by looking at your salary cash flow for the next 3 months and thinking about how you can reduce that. So you probably want to retain your workforce or some of them, but reduce some of those people costs. Some of the things you could be looking at there would be reducing your self-employed contractors, even if on a temporary basis. You could be asking some of your team to take unpaid sabbaticals or unpaid leave. You could be looking at reduced pay or hours, or even looking to temporarily suspend any employee benefits that you provide to your workforce. Now, of course, where you do have a workforce presence, you might want to think about how you're going to work effectively with those employees. So you might want to consider remote working or support those that continue to work on site. So if you've got people working from home, you are still responsible for their health, safety and well-being. So you do need to think about the working environment that they're going to be operating in. And I think we will start to see a number of musculoskeletal issues as people are working inappropriately at their kitchen table, as an example. So do try and think about undertaking some kind of home working risk assessment with your employees and ensuring that they've got right equipment and support that they need. Of course, if you've got people still working in the workplace, then again, you equally need to keep those individuals safe. So you might want to think there about splitting your workforce into maybe having split shifts coming in at different times of the day, thinking about how you're going to socially distance in the workplace and what extra PPE you're going to be providing for your employees. And of course, if you do need to reduce your workforce in the short term, then you can make use of the coronavirus job retention scheme and furlough employees where required. And you won't have to furlough everybody, but you might just choose to furlough a small section of the workforce. Now, if you think that the impact on your business is going to be much more in the longer term, then you may want to consider what loans and grants may be available to your business to support you with your cash flow while you go through the crisis. And as Rich said, we do offer a 1-hour free session to look at the grants and support available to you, and it may well be worth you taking that up to think about what you can tap into. Equally, as I said, use the job retention scheme to furlough staff in the interim. Now, having the scheme in place and with the grant from the government covering 80% of salary, it really does give you a bit of breathing space to furlough your employees, think about the impact of your business longer term, and then make decisions about what you want to do with your employees. And it's a great way of supporting your people through a difficult time while you make that decision. But of course, you know, ultimately you may have to make some workforce redundancy reductions, and therefore that may look like redundancy or layoff. But I strongly recommend that before you do any of those things, you do undertake a thorough review. It's going to be quite costly for you to recruit again later. So if you just make your workforce redundant now, when you come back, of course, you've then got the cost of re-recruiting, retraining employees. So try to maintain some element of workforce where you can. Now, in any event, how you go about doing some of these things is critically important. So you do want to think about how you can support your staff effectively, and really engage with them during this process. And in doing that, you will need to communicate and over communicate, if anything. Certainly with the teams that I've worked with where we've had to furlough employees, they have been much more supportive of the process that we're undertaking because they understand where the business is at, because the business owners and leaders have communicated effectively about how the current crisis is affecting the business and its ability to perform. And in any event, everything that you do, you should be thinking about acting ethically. We've certainly all seen some of the sense of anger that is out there when we think about organisations like Virgin, Wetherspoons, Sports Direct, and that's going to have a real impact on their reputation moving forward. I make no apologies for the fact that employees are going to remember the way that you deal with this situation. And so thinking about your reputation moving forward and how critical that's going to be to your recovery, absolutely thinking about the way that you go about making decisions and enacting some of those decisions is critical. There's a range of options that you, when we look at this flowchart, that you could be considering. So it may be business as usual, thinking about how you manage that. You may have employees working from home or remotely. You may need to think about laying people off or reducing their hours or pay, asking employees to maybe take unpaid sabbaticals, and finally, of course, furloughing them or asking them to consider voluntary or having to make difficult decisions about redundancy. So as I said, as an employer, you've got a whole range of options available to you. Some you may use in totality, or you may use bits of different options depending on your current circumstances. But making sure that you understand the legal implications of each of those decisions is going to be absolutely critical. So when we think about legal compliance, it's going to be very important for you right now not to fall foul of employment law. So don't let panic decisions be made and then ignore your legislative obligations. So you do need to think about that. Now, right now, there is going to be an impact on some of your existing employment policies, such as the way that you manage holidays or you manage staff absence or sickness. So you might want to review some of the policies that are currently affected, or alternatively, you might want to create a coronavirus policy. And that policy could address all of your other policies that are affected by way of saying, this is what the normal process is, but during the period of this pandemic, this is going to be the revised process. And you can then stand that policy down once we're through the crisis and lockdown period. As I said, there are some new laws and legislation that have been introduced over the last few weeks. And firstly and foremostly has been the Coronavirus Act. And that became law on the 25th of March. The intention is for it to remain in place for 2 years, but it is going to be reviewed on a 6-monthly basis to ensure that it is still fit for purpose. Now, the Act itself covers lots of different areas, most of which are non-HR related, but there are 3 key parts to the Act which will affect HR. The first is it covers off SSP and how SSP can be managed during the crisis period. It also gives powers for emergency volunteering, and you will need to think about that if you have employees that are requesting time off to volunteer, especially where they might be returning to some of the emergency services on a temporary basis. And Section 76 of the Coronavirus Act gives the Treasury power to direct some of the HMRC functions in relation to coronavirus, and more specifically, we would see that as things like the job retention scheme. So you will need to ensure that when you're looking at all of these, that you don't discriminate against your existing employees. So thinking about the Treasury Directive, that was set on the 15th of April, and as I said, it sets out the job retention scheme. Now that directive is then interpreted by HMRC into the guidance that we see that is constantly being updated. I think the latest version of the guidance is the 23rd of April. So again, you need to make sure that you're looking at the most up-to-date version of the guidance because it is constantly changing. Now, there were a number of other legislative changes that came about on April the 6th that, of course, in the middle of all of this, you may have lost sight of. there was a requirement to issue a new type of terms and conditions, and for those terms and conditions to be issued from day one of employment. The way that we calculate holiday and normal pay has changed. The way that we manage agency workers, that's changed also. And there is also a new act that has come in, which is the parental bereavement leave, which you know, hopefully we won't have to exercise, but you will need to be mindful of those changes and make sure that you've amended your HR practices to take those into account. And as I said, normal HR legislation does still apply, and the way that we interpret that, some guidance and direction has been amended in terms of things like holiday management, the way that we can now carry some holiday over for the next year or 2 years, and there has been some changes to maternity protection. So like I say, a whole host of changes that you're going to have to take on board and consider at a time when you're going to find it very difficult to make some of those very difficult decisions about the future of your business. So I would strongly advise that you take the appropriate advice and again, get one-to-one help and support before you enact any decisions that you may well have made. So moving on, I'd like to have a quick look at some of the support mechanisms and some of those options that are available to you. So I've tried to capture here just some of the key points of the job retention scheme. So this scheme, and as we know, it's furloughing employees. This may be very useful where you've got no work available at all for some of your employees, or where you've got reduced work. So what you might want to consider is taking a section of your workforce and furloughing those and asking another section of your workforce to stay in place and cover what work there is. Now, as I said, the latest guidance is dated the 23rd of April, but you do need to stay up to date to make sure that you're on top of any changes. So the scheme itself was launched on the 20th of March by the Chancellor, and the scheme is intended to support employers to maintain their workforce where their operations have been severely affected by the coronavirus crisis. So the broad remit is really very helpful now for employers to think about how you can use the scheme effectively to support you through a temporary period. It is open to all employers regardless of type, so whether you're an agency, a charity, a sole trader or a limited company or partnership, everybody can tap into and make use of the scheme. And it is also valid for all contract types, whether that's 0 hours, full-time, part-time. It also includes fixed-term contracts. And an interesting point is where a fixed-term contract may come to an end during a period of furlough, you will have the right to extend that contract and to retain the employee and keep them on furlough for the duration of the grant scheme. So the scheme itself runs from the 1st of March, and you can backdate where required, and it's recently been extended to the 30th of June. And I'm sure that position will continue to be under review as we understand more about the longer term impact on industry. Now, if you are going to furlough your employees, you must do that for a minimum of a 3-week period. So you can furlough people in blocks. So you can furlough somebody, they remain away from the workforce for a 3-week period. You can then bring them back in for a temporary period of time, maybe 1 or 2 weeks, and then re-furlough them. But every time you place them onto furlough, it must be for a minimum of 3 weeks. Now, you can claim up to 80% of usual monthly wage costs, and that's up to £2,500 per month, plus the associated employer NI and pension contributions. Now, pension contributions are only covered at the 3% statutory minimum, so if you do offer an uplift to your employees, you will only be able to claim 80% of the 3% that you would normally pay. Now, employers can top up to 100%, but they don't have to. So you do have the choice of whether or not you should top up. There are some circumstances in which you will need to top up, and we'll talk about that shortly. Now, a really key area here is that the workers should not perform any work for the employer or any associated companies whilst they're on furlough leave. So what do we mean by work? Well, that's the completion of any productive work or the delivery of any services that may generate income or profit to the company. Some employees won't be able to tap into the scheme immediately, And that might be because they're working from home and receiving payment for that work, even if that work is on reduced hours. So you may want to think about whether you do need to continue to have somebody working and undertaking and completing any work, or whether you could furlough that employee. Now, equally, if you have an employee who is on short-term sick because they have demonstrated symptoms of coronavirus, or they're at risk because somebody in their household is symptomatic, they will need to complete their period of SSP, and then when they return to work, you'll be able to furlough them. Interestingly, if somebody becomes sick with coronavirus while they are furloughed, you don't need to take them off furlough, put them onto SSP, and then re-furlough them after. You can just leave them as furloughed. Now, employees that are shielding, because they are under a vulnerable category as stated by the government authorities, can furlough, as can people with caring responsibilities, either for a sick or elderly relative, as an example, a dependent relative, or because they're having to stay at home and look after their children because, of course, the schools are currently closed. Equally, somebody who's on long-term sick, you can bring them back into the workplace and furlough them, and then they could return to long-term sickness once the period of furlough has come to an end. Now, whilst somebody is furloughed, whilst they can't complete any work, they can complete training. Now, when somebody is undertaking training, they must be paid the national minimum wage. So you do need to be mindful that if 80% of their salary takes them below national minimum wage, that's fine for the purpose of the scheme, but when completing training, they must be receiving that minimum wage level. They can undertake other work, so they could go and work for a different employer completely while they're under a period of furlough. But of course, as soon as the period of furlough comes to an end and you request that they attend the workplace, they've got to be available to do that for you, because they are still under the commitment of terms and conditions of employment, and they can volunteer, so they're perfectly entitled to do any of those things. The scheme itself does cover limb workers, so these are dependent contractors who you may pay through your PAYE system. But if you do have independent contractors who charge you by way of invoice, they won't be able to claim through the scheme, but they will be able to tap into the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme. And we have some limited detail about that, but we'll hear more probably towards the end of May. Now, an employee can request to be furloughed. So I get lots of people saying, well, you know, I left the company just before this happened, or I was working my period of notice and I tried to withdraw my notice, but my employer said, no, I still had to leave. Or somebody who needs and feels that they need to shield and they feel very vulnerable in the workplace. Any of those individuals can ask you if they can be furloughed. It's entirely up to you whether you agree and grant any acceptance of that redesignation of their employment. So moving on, let's have a look at the online application system. So the system went live on the 20th of April. Now, the system has got the capability of taking up to 450,000 claims per day. I'm sure HMRC are going to manage that so that they've got their 5,000 people working on operating the system so that they can spread some of those claims out. But just looking at the figures that we saw on day one, so at midnight of day one of the system going live, the system had processed 185,000 claims. 1.3 million workers have been placed onto furlough at a cost of £1.5 billion in wages overall. The current estimation is that it's likely to be more like 10 million workers that are furloughed over the period of the crisis at a cost of somewhere upwards of £42 billion. So it's quite a costly exercise for the government to support business and industry. Now, there's been quite a few people say, well, I don't fully understand what it is that I'm supposed to be claiming for. Is it gross salary, net salary? What are the additional elements that I should be paying? Should I be paying for commission? Should I be paying for any benefits in kind? The government has produced some very useful guidance sheets, and I've added a link here for you. This particular document does give you some examples of how to calculate somebody's salary. So it's an incredibly useful thing for you to have a look at. I think one of the things to bear in mind is you do need to understand this before you get online and start to make a claim, and to be really organised and structured in the way you go about doing it. Now, I know a number of companies have fallen foul of this next one, which is making multiple claims in any period. You can only make one claim per period, which is a calendar month. So if you're currently claiming for April and you need to backdate for March, make sure you put one claim in initially for March and April, and then continue to claim on a monthly basis beyond that. I have heard of some employers who have put their March claim in, expecting to be able to go back in and put an April claim in, only to find that they've got to wait a month before they can do that. Now, you can process your claim anytime once your real-time information payroll has been run, even if that's in advance of you paying the wages. So there's a lot of trust here in terms of HMRC trusting the employer to pass on everything that they have put their claim in for. Once you make your claim, then you should receive payment within 6 working days of the claim being made. And we've certainly started to see now some of those payments arriving into the designated bank accounts that employers stated when they process their claim. Now, one area that I just do want to give you a quick tip on, and that is there's a 30-minute inactivity timeout on the system. Now, if you've got 100 or more employees, you can upload a CSV file, and that's great. But if you've got 99 or less, you're going to have to sit and key in each one of those individual employees' details. Now, if you get halfway through and you discover that you're some information missing and you go off to find that information, if you are inactive on the system for 30 minutes, it will time you out. There's no save at the point at which you exited or save and return later. You will lose your entire claim and you will have to reprocess from scratch. So that's why it's critically important for you to understand what it is you're claiming before you start putting that process through. I thought it'd be useful just to run through some of the useful tips and points that have been picked up over the last few days, just to make sure that you fully understand some of those changes that have come about. So employers must have created and started a PAYE scheme on or before the 19th of March, and that previously, of course, was the 28th of February. Now, a really important point here is if you've got a manual PAYE scheme, you will have to register online before you can make your application. And that online process, registration process, can take up to 10 days. So you do need to get yourself registered so that you can then process your application when the time's right. The scheme itself covers employees who are on payroll on or before the 19th of March, and which were notified to HMRC on an RTI submission on or before that date. Now, unfortunately, for some employers, they may well, especially if they're running monthly payroll, have employed somebody at the beginning of March, not put them onto the HMRC system, add them onto your payroll system, and not put them onto your RTI submission on or before the 19th of March. And unfortunately, if employees fall into that category, they will not be eligible for the job retention scheme. Now, employees that were employed as at the 28th of February, who have subsequently left the company either by way of redundancy or by notice, even if they've been dismissed through poor performance, you can re-employ them and furlough those employees if you want to, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Now, under normal circumstances, workers on work visas are not able to access public funds. The government has confirmed that it doesn't consider the scheme, the job retention scheme, to be classed as public funds. So if you have got any employees working under any type of work visa, they again can be furloughed and you can access the grant money to cover their salaries. Now, there has been a lot of speculation around the clarification of regular wages and salary and what can and can't be claimed. One of the things that I would just point out to you now is that salary is being calculated based on calendar days, not on working days. And I think a number of employers have fallen foul of that because they calculate their employees' salary on working days. So again, I strongly recommend that you refer back to the guidance to make sure you fully understand what it is you're claiming for before you start to put that claim through. HMRC will not calculate it for you, so you've got to do the calculation for yourself. Now, you will need to retain records for a 5-year period, and I strongly recommend that you do that. We have heard that directors can be furloughed, providing that the only work that they conduct is from an act of Parliament. Now, I think that's a very narrow description, and I think, again, just to be guided and warned that you need to consider clearly as directors of a company what it is you can and can't do before you make the decision whether or not to furlough yourself or other directors of the company. Now, a point that has caused a little bit of panic and speculation, I think, over the last few days has been the point of to make a claim, employers and employees must have agreement in writing. So I do want to just give you some clarification of that, and I am going to read the full clarification just so that we don't get confused at all. So to be eligible for the grant, employers must confirm in writing to their employee confirming that they have been furloughed. If this is done in a way that is consistent with employment law, that consent is valid for the purposes of claiming the CJRS. There needs to be a written record, but the employee does not have to provide a written response. A record of this communication must be kept for 5 years. Now, think back a few slides, and I said to you that the Treasury had issued a directive on the 15th of April. And the directive on the 15th of April said and clearly stated that the employee must agree in writing. Subsequent guidance from HMRC, which came a number of days later, interpreted that in a very different way and said the employee does not have to provide a written response, provided the employer has written to the employee. So we will go with the HMRC guidance because that was dated after the directive. And if HMRC now went back on that, then they may well be in hot water and liable to judicial claims because, of course, their guidance has stated one thing. They can't now act in a very different way. So the answer is not to panic. If you've written to your employees to confirm that they've been furloughed, then that should be sufficient. What I would strongly recommend that you don't do is to start asking your employees to backdate any signed agreements, because equally that could land you into some hot water. And then the final point here is annual leave must be topped up for statutory entitlement. So there's still some debate about whether or not you can force your employees to take annual leave, but certainly where employees do take annual leave, where it is part of the statutory entitlement, so the 5.6 weeks that they're entitled to in any given year, that must be topped up to 100% by the employer. Now, if you have an employee who's entitled to 30 days holiday per annum as part of your terms and conditions, obviously 20 of those are part of the working time directive. So those additional 10 days outside of bank holidays, if you want to pay them 80%, then that's entirely up to you, but the statutory days must be paid. And we've already heard, haven't we, that annual leave can be carried over. So again, you know, make sure that you're aware of what leave it is that they're taking and whether or not and how you carry some of that over. So let's just take a look at short time and layoff working. So some of the scenarios and circumstances where it might be appropriate to use this will be clearly where furloughing is not an option. And that might be because there's still some work to be done, so you can't completely cease all work and activity with your employee. It might be that you fell foul of the March the 19th rule, and so you've got some employees that aren't covered as part of that cut-off date and when you submitted your payroll information. Or it may be that you're unable to comply with the 3-week blocks. So you might need to furlough or not have somebody in the workplace for 1 or 2 weeks, but then bring them back. So in those circumstances, it might be appropriate for you to lay off temporarily or put people onto short-term working. And it's quite common to see this as a contractual term in manufacturing companies where they may well have peaks and troughs of manufacturing requirements. You would tend to see it less in other industry types, but it may well be there as part of terms and conditions of employment. So you can lay off an employee and ask them to stay at home or take unpaid leave when you temporarily are unable to give them paid work as long as the employment contract allows you to do that, or you have subsequent agreement with them in place to do that. A short-time working is when an employee works reduced hours or is paid less than half a week's pay. Now, if you decide simply to send your employees home because you don't have any work for them, but you neither have a contractual right to put them onto unpaid working, nor have you subsequently agreed that they're going to take a period of unpaid leave, then I'm afraid if you sent them home, that's going to have to be on full pay. It's only going to be where the employment contract allows you to do that you can do that with no pay, or certainly the minimum guaranteed pay. Now, if you fail to do that, there are a number of areas that you may well be vulnerable to claim. Firstly, your employee could claim breach of contract because clearly you didn't have contractual terms to impose that. Secondly, they could claim unlawful deductions if you deduct salary without an agreement being in place. And finally, they could claim constructive unfair dismissal. So again, it's back to that point of making sure you fully understand and that you don't fall foul of the law. Now, during that time of layoff, the employee is entitled to a guaranteed pay during the period of layoff and short-time working. And just to be clear, that's for employees. It's not agency staff or self-employed people are not eligible for the minimum pay guarantees. So the maximum payment is £29 a day for 5 days in any 3-month period, subject to them being eligible for that payment. So a maximum of £145, unless it's stated otherwise in any agreement that you have or in a contract of employment. Now, there's no limit for how long an employee can be laid off or put onto short-time working, and just be mindful that the employee could apply for redundancy and claim redundancy pay if it's been more than 4 weeks in a row or 6 weeks in a 13-week period, providing that not more than 3 weeks of that is consecutively. As I said, not paying guaranteed pay counts as an unlawful deduction from wages, so you need to be mindful of that. Now, as I said, the employee could claim redundancy, but for them to do that, they must, in writing to you, resign and state their intent to claim redundancy. Now, you can avoid that situation if within 7 days of receiving that letter from them, you put in a counter notice, and that would be based on you having a reasonable expectation that the employee would, no later than 4 weeks after the date, enter into a continuous 13-week period of employment without further interruption. That would be your counter to stop any redundancy claim being made. Now, you can bring somebody back if you've already put them on to laid off working or short-time working. You can bring them back and then furlough them, but only if that occurred after the 28th of February. So if before the 28th of February you'd already agreed a period of layoff or unpaid layoff or short-time working, they will need to complete that period of time that you have an agreement in place for. Once they return, you can then furlough them from their employment. So moving on to have a look at redundancy, and hopefully, you know, this will be kept to a minimum. But even with the job retention scheme and other support schemes available, some businesses will be forced to reduce their workforce. Now, for a redundancy to be genuine, the employer must demonstrate that the employee's job will no longer exist, and that sits broadly in 3 camps. Firstly, that work of a particular kind has ceased to exist. Secondly, work in a particular place has ceased to exist. Or thirdly, that the business has closed completely. So you always need to take steps to avoid redundancy before dismissing staff, and this really is your last port of call, if you like, when it comes to managing your workforce. You will have to refer to your current policy, and if you don't have a redundancy policy in place, then I strongly recommend that you refer to somebody like ACAS and you take their guidance and certainly processes, which will be the fallback point for any employment tribunal. They'll always refer to ACAS processes and procedures. So you will have to pay redundancy pay, and you will have to provide a notice period. But of course, that notice period could be served while somebody's on a period of furlough. So again, that will help you to manage that process through. Now, you must follow a correct and fair procedure. And what that means is consultation must be meaningful. Now, it depends on the number of employees that you have affected. That will determine how and what that fair procedure looks like. So let's assume, for the purposes of this exercise, that you want to serve notice on the 30th of June. So if you have 100 or more employees at risk of redundancy in any 90-day period, then you will have to consult for a minimum of 45 days. So if you wanted to serve notice on the 30th of June, you would have to begin your consultation period no later than the 15th of May. Likewise, if you have 20 or more employees at risk of redundancy, that consultation period becomes 30 days, and therefore the latest you should be starting consultation would be the 30th of May. Now, in both of those scenarios, of course, you will have to inform the authorities of your position, and you will have to appoint employee reps. So when you think about that, you will start to see that really it's something you should be considering now, because time will be moving on relatively quickly for you to be able to hit those deadlines. If you've got less than 20 employees at risk, then you do have to consult in a meaningful way, and I would strongly recommend that that would be no later than the 15th of June. Now, of course, organisations could claim special circumstances, and only in special circumstances would you be able to waive any consultation period. Normally, that is because the work has ceased immediately, and therefore you've not had an opportunity to consult with your employees. Now, my personal view is that I think with having the job retention scheme in place and your ability to furlough your entire workforce, I think that was probably going to negate any claim for special circumstances, because of course you could furlough, their salary is covered at 80% by the government grant, whilst you go through a period of consultation. So I'm not sure that any employer would be able to necessarily fall back on special circumstances as a reason not to have consulted with their employees. But again, make sure that you take the appropriate legal action without a doubt. Now, if you've made people redundant on or after the 28th of February, you can re-employ those individuals and place them on furlough, provided they appeared on the HMRC real-time information submission as at the 28th of February. And likewise, anybody that was made redundant on or after the 19th of March can be re-employed, provided they were on the submission on or before the 19th of March. So you could be looking at who you've already made redundant and think about bringing those back into the workplace and placing on furlough. And as I said, employees on a fixed term contract can be re-employed, and they equally can have their fixed term contract extended, and then you can place them on furlough, as you can somebody that may have left by their own voluntary choice, or that you may well even have dismissed through misconduct. So moving on to employees who are sick, and I just wanted to cover this because I think it's quite an important point for you. So if you have an employee who develops systems whilst they're on site and at work for you, you will need to send that employee home immediately. Now, it's not necessary for you to close the workplace, but I would strongly recommend that you call NHS 111 for advice, and you assess others in the workplace to ensure and to quantify the level of risk that they have been exposed to. And then you might need to make some appropriate choices and take some appropriate action. Now, if you have an employee who is sick themselves because of coronavirus, or they're advised to self-isolate, they will be eligible for SSP from day one. They'll also be able to top up their salary with universal credit or contributory employment support allowance. But you will need to use your discretion. If somebody says they're unwell, of course, they won't necessarily have any evidence because they might not have been to see a doctor. But they can go through the NHS 111 website and download an isolation note, an isolation certificate, which they could give to you, which you could pop with the documentation relating to their absence to at least show that some evidence was gathered. Now, depending on the circumstances, they will need to isolate for either a 7 or a 14-day period. So if they live on their own, or they demonstrated the symptoms, then they will need to self-isolate for 7 days. If they're in a household with somebody else who has displayed symptoms, then they will need to isolate for a 14-day period. Now, if you have an employee who needs to care for a child or a sick dependent, there are a couple of avenues that you could go down. The first is that employee would be entitled to a minimum amount of time based on time off for dependents. That's normally a couple of days. They don't necessarily have any statutory right to pay, and you could, if you wanted to, enforce that they take unpaid leave beyond that. But of course, we now know, don't we, through the job retention scheme, that for somebody who has to care for a child or a sick dependent, you could furlough them as an option. Now, it's entirely up to you what you do, and you will need to make a decision that's appropriate for both you and your employee. So if you do have employees that have gone off sick, you have the ability through the statutory sick pay rebate scheme to claim that statutory sick pay back. Now, that's only for people that were sick on or after the 13th of March, and you will be able to claim back the current rate of SSP of £95.85 a week. You'll be able to claim that for up to 2 weeks in the first day of sickness. However, the absence must have been for a minimum of 4 days. The employee must have been absent as a result of coronavirus, whether that because they've been infected themselves and were displaying symptoms, or whether they're self-isolating because they may be or may become affected. A doctor's fit note is not required, but as I said, try and get some kind of anecdotal evidence, even if that's recording when your employee said that they made contact with NHS 111, or what they'd done to try and establish the symptoms and whether or not they were related to coronavirus. Now, it can be used by employers if they are claiming for an employee who is eligible, and there is eligibility criteria attached to this. If you had a PAYE payroll system in place before the 28th of February, and if you have fewer than 250 employees as at the 28th of February. Like most of these schemes and grants, it does cover all contract types. Now, you must keep records of the illness and for 3 years beyond any claim. Obviously, we're not in the position of being able to claim as at today. The information that you do need to keep are the dates that the employee was sick, which were those qualifying days, the reason they were absent. So whether it was because they were demonstrating symptoms themselves, or whether they were having to isolate due to symptoms being present in their household, and their employee's NI number. So make sure that you've got that information and that you're retaining it. Now, there's nothing to do right now. You're not able to claim yet. There will be an online service available shortly, and once that's available, you will then be able to process any backdated claims and, of course, any future claims that you may have. So moving on to the last slide, I just wanted to, I guess, capture a few points that I've made during the presentation and give a little bit of advice about how you might go about doing some of these things. I think the most important and fundamental piece that you will need to think about through all of this is communication. And communication is going to be key for your employees. Most employees are going to understand that you're doing your best to consider the position of both the business and for them as part of your team, if they're included in the conversation, if they're aware of what's going on, and if you communicate with them regularly. And as I said, you know, every meeting that I've sat in on where we've had to furlough or issue redundancy notice to employees, they're absolutely understanding because companies made the effort to keep them informed about what's happening. So you will need to consider both the needs of the business and the employee and how you can support both, because it's really important for you that you've got a business to return to once this is over, and it will be over. But equally important that you have employees that are engaged and committed to your organisation when you need them to come back and perform. You do need to ensure that your cash flow is understood, and if it was me, I would be scenario planning, maybe thinking about what's the cash effect if this carries on for 3 months, if it carries on for 6 months, but also what's my recovery mode? Am I in a business that's going to bounce back immediately, or is there going to be a gradual growth period where I'm going to have to think about what my workforce requirements are? Because I might not want everybody back on day one 100%. I might need to bring them back gradually. And so what does that look like for me? You do need to think about all options. So how else can you support your cash flow? So what else is available out there to you as an employer, as a business, to think about how you can boost your cash flow in the short term. You will need to ensure that you're compliant with your legal obligations and take the appropriate advice that's given to you. Make sure that you understand every option before you enact that option. It's going to be really costly for you to backpedal rather than taking your time and consider fully what your options are before you make a decision. Really important for you that you don't discriminate right now, either indirectly or directly. And just to give you a couple of examples of what that might look like, direct discrimination might look like you have women in the workplace who have asked to work flexibly or be furloughed because they have caring responsibilities for children as a result of the school closure. They may well be disproportionately affected, more than men, and if you say no to those requests without considering effectively, you could fall foul of sex discrimination. Equally, if you have people working for you that sit within those vulnerable groups, and that we know that a number of government departments have recommended that they shield. Now again, if you refuse to furlough that person or allow them to be absent from the workplace without any support, you could fall foul of discrimination by way of disability. And equally, discrimination by association if you're not supporting somebody who is a carer of somebody with classed as disabled. So you can see there are a number of areas without even knowing and being consciously aware of it that you may fall foul. So really do think about those things. You will need to understand the mental health and well-being of your employees in each category, and each will be having a very different experience. So if you've got people working from home, they may well be having to balance homeschooling, home working, as well as generally coping with the stress and anxiety that we're all feeling as a result of the current situation. So you need to think about how you're going to support them. They're not used to working from home. And so how do you manage their tasks appropriately? You may well have people in the workplace who are both feeling guilty for having come into the workplace, but also may well be very concerned that they're coming into the workplace and potentially taking infection back into their own household. So how can you assure them and how can you support them through this time? You may well have employees that are furloughed, and the last thing you want is to have a whole team of employees who now feel disconnected from the workplace. So how can you get that sense of team? How can you get everybody included and involved? And that might be through virtual coffee mornings, social events, obviously virtually held. But again, just to make sure that people feel part of the team still. And then finally, people that have been made redundant, they will have no earnings potentially. And so what can you do to support those? So a few areas there for you to consider. You will need to keep appropriate records and retain very good records. I think it would be very easy right now to have a verbal conversation with somebody and put an agreement in place, and then later somebody might not have a strong recollection. One of the things again under stress and pressure that we will be feeling, and what will happen is we become quite forgetful, and we genuinely could forget that we've had a conversation with somebody about something. So everything you agree, back that up in writing and retain those records. And then finally, and positively, look for the opportunities. So you have an ability to train and upskill some of your employees whilst they're furloughed from the workplace. Great way of starting to multi-skill your workforce to give you a little bit more flexibility and agility when you think about the future of the business. You've got an opportunity to diversify your business and do other things, and we see many companies, don't we, who are now doing something very different to their normal practice, but are thinking in a very different way and pivoting their businesses. One of the things you might want to do when you think about the employee's ability to volunteer whilst they're on furlough is, rather than just let them get on with it themselves, you might want to find a local organisation who you can actively help and support your people to become volunteers. And again, think about your branding as a local organisation, but also your branding as an employer and how engaging you are with your employees. And on that note, maintain healthy engagement, because what you really do want is for your employee to return to business at the time that you're ready, in a way that means you're going to be as productive as you can be. And if you treat your people fairly and reasonably and build a positive reputation, then you can absolutely come back and be stronger potentially than you were before. So I think they're the main things that I wanted to cover today. Do we have any questions?
Right, Kate, I've got a few questions actually have been built up.
Okay.
So here's some of the questions. Can I furlough an apprentice?
Oh, okay. Yes, good question. Yes, you can furlough an apprentice. The time that they're on furlough, of course, they will be seen as training. So go back to my original point with when you have an employee that is specifically on training, they will need to be at the minimum wage. So you do need to think about the appropriate minimum wage for an apprentice whilst they're under furlough. So as long as you're doing that, they can absolutely do that and continue the training, and a great opportunity for them to, really get that training underway.
Okay. When will the SSP reclaim scheme be open?
Yes, okay. Now, there's been no official announcement. I have heard that it's going to be on the 4th of May, but that's not from an official source. I've certainly not been able to see anything that says officially it's the 4th of May, unless, Rich, you know anything different to me.
No, I've not heard anything otherwise.
No. So I think probably early May.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned about furlough workers, furloughed employees being able to work for another organisation.
Yes.
But presumably that is dependent on what their employment contract states.
Yes, absolutely. So I work with a number of employers, some who have nothing in the employment contract, some who say they absolutely cannot have a second job. And if that's the case, then unfortunately the employee won't be able to go and do that. Or thirdly, it might say that you can have a second job, providing that it does not compete or cause any issue for the existing employer. So you will need to think about all of those things. And of course, even if your contract says it's okay, you might want to think about conflict of interest. So yeah, absolutely allow them to do that, but equally bear in mind they do need to be available for you to come back to work when you ask them to come back.
Okay. And how does annual leave accrue when a person is laid off?
So both through layoff and through furlough, the terms and conditions of employment are and remain in place. So anything that's in somebody's terms and conditions will continue throughout. So the accrual of holiday will continue, whether that's because you're furloughed and you're receiving some pay, or whether you've been laid off and you're not receiving any pay, you will still continue to accrue holiday. Okay.
And just on that point, you mentioned that the 5.6 weeks, the statutory pay, I believe you said has to be paid at 100% rather than the 80%. Is that correct?
Yes. So the 4 weeks and the bank holiday should all be paid at 100%. But if you give somebody additional holiday on top of the statutory minimum, it's your choice as to whether or not you pay that at 100%. So you've got to be really clear: is it a statutory holiday day, or is it an additional day?
Just another question on holidays. You mentioned again briefly in passing about forcing or requiring staff to take holiday.
Yes.
What is your view on this? Because I can see a lot of employers wanting their staff to take holiday because effectively when they come back, they could have an excess burden of holiday, which they don't want them to spread over the next year and a half, but they rather to have used whilst they've been off on furlough.
Yeah. So the general rule of thumb is if you were asking somebody or forcing somebody to take holiday, providing you give them double the amount of time notice, so as long as you give them plenty of notice up front, I would probably be recommending that you do ask employees to take some element of holiday. I wouldn't force them to take their entire holiday entitlement. But I certainly would be thinking about, potentially 1 day a week where you uplift that to, 100% as a little bit of an enticement for the employee to take it. Of course, the issue you've got is if you force somebody to take all of their holiday, you do have to uplift, and it may well be that you have no cash flow. So it's getting that balance right. But I think good communication with an employee should understand.
And just talking good cash flow, it does appear that the the CJRS scheme is paying quite quickly. It's paying within about 6 days of the application being made. But as you said, it's based on a calendar day, not a working day. So from a user perspective, how easy is it to actually access the scheme, and how simple is it to make those calculations?
Well, I think provided you read the guidance and you take any advice that you can beforehand, and that may well be through your payroll provider, through an HR provider, through your accountant, then I think it can be relatively simple. I think it's where you don't do that homework and you don't fully understand and make your calculations in advance of the claim, then I think it can make the claim very messy and a very bad experience for you. But certainly every accountant I've worked with, they are finding the system relatively simple. And I think the other issue is understanding some of those add-on payments such as commission, etc.
Okay. And just on that point, you mentioned about not being able to make a claim before an RTI submission. What happens if you do?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
I would imagine that you won't be able to, because the system won't recognise that you've made that you've submitted your RTI submission. But I would say go and speak to your payroll provider or accountant. Okay.
And just some more questions around furloughing. So am I able to furlough somebody whilst they're sick?
Yes. What you can't do, so you can't put somebody onto furlough while they're on short-term sickness. So if somebody is on 2 weeks or a week sick because they've got coronavirus, or they're in a household that's demonstrating symptoms, you'll have to wait for them to come back, and then you can furlough them. Interestingly, if somebody becomes sick whilst they're on furlough, you don't need to bring them off, put them onto statutory sick pay, and then put them back on again. And if you've got somebody on long-term sick, you can bring them off of long-term sick, furlough them, and then put them back onto long-term sick after the furlough period is finished.
Okay. And presuming on that point of whilst they're on furlough, do you need to wait until the end of the furlough period before you can make somebody redundant?
No, I would. You don't have to wait at all. No, it's entirely your choice. I think what you could do is start your consultation now so that you're ready. But of course, no, it's entirely up to you. So you could make somebody redundant now, and you simply take them off of furlough. I think it depends very much on somebody's notice period, because why would you take somebody off of furlough when their salary is being covered by the government if you can cover it? But if you can't, then of course you may have to resort to making them redundant.
Okay, and last couple of questions are more of interest to me than anything else, so apologies for that. Just a couple of things you mentioned in passing. One was about layoffs and the guaranteed pay. Is that a contractual term, or is that a government requirement, £145 maximum?
That's a government requirement.
Okay.
So contractually, you would say that you can have somebody on a period of unpaid leave, but in any event, they would have to get that statutory minimum for that short period.
Okay, fine. And you also mentioned a limb worker, which is not a term I've come across before, which is a dependent contractor as opposed to independent contractor, which you get. What is a dependent contractor?
So the criteria would be whether or not they're paid through their PAYE system. So you could have somebody who's dependent contractor, but you pay them through payroll, versus you've got a contract for services. So the key piece here on all of this actually is whether or not they're part of the PAYE scheme. If they are, they qualify. If they're not, they won't.
And does PAYE as such extend to the CIS scheme under that remit?
Say that again.
So does the PAYE extend to the CIS scheme, which is the construction industry scheme?
It must. Well, yeah, it goes back to if they're on PAYE.
Yeah.
So because of course, if they're not on PAYE, there won't be an HMRC record of them.
Okay. Okay, really interesting. Okay, thanks, Kate, very much. Really appreciate that. Thanks for all the questions, guys. Right, just the final point, just to say we have got further seminars coming up. On Thursday of this week, we have one on accessing finance and looking at some of the other schemes which are also available. And on Tuesday next week, we have one on working from home, mental health and well-being, which actually Kate is doing again with an external speaker, we believe. Furthermore, there is, as we've mentioned right at the beginning, there is free one-to-one support available for businesses within this area. You can access both of these, the seminars and the one-to-one sessions, via the cpcabusinesssupport.co.uk website, or you can email support@cpcabusinesssupport.co.uk. Thanks again very much for attending, and I hope you got something worthwhile out of this meeting. Thanks again, guys. Bye.